All right, let's dive right in. When you hear the names Lewis and Clark, your brain probably jumps straight to some dusty middle school textbook, right? Just a couple of guys in frontier clothes pointing at mountains. But the reality of the Corps of Discovery expedition, oh, it is so much more intense than that. We are talking about a grueling, totally awe-inspiring, and frankly, incredibly dangerous 862-day journey into the absolute unknown. In this explainer, we're going to strip away all that centuries-old myth-making and look at the raw, unfiltered facts of what this road trip actually entailed. It's a massive story of survival, high-stakes diplomacy, mind-blowing scientific discovery, and honestly, some pretty complex human legacies. We've got a ton of ground to cover today. Here is our roadmap. We'll start with Section 1, the grand ambition, then 2, assembling the core, Section 3, into the unknown, 4, the vital interpreter, 5, ocean in view, and we'll wrap it all up with Section 6, the true legacy. Let's hit the trail.
So, Section 1, the grand ambition, Jefferson's real motives.
Now, it's a super common misconception that President Thomas Jefferson launched this whole massive endeavor just because he loved science and botany. I mean, sure, he was a curious guy with a huge library on North American geography, but his real motives, they were way more calculated. He actually had three main priorities. First up, commerce. He was absolutely desperate to find a practical, all-water route straight across the continent. He basically wanted to bypass the scorching Southwest completely and link the Missouri River right to the Pacific Ocean. Number 2, empire building. The U.S. had literally just inked the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and Jefferson wanted to formally plant the flag and declare U.S. sovereignty over the Native American nations living there. And third, beating his European rivals to the punch. Jefferson knew the British were already eyeing the super lucrative fur trade out on the Columbia River. He had to get an American presence out there, document it, and claim the land by right of discovery before anybody else could. The science and topography, yeah, they were on the agenda, but they were definitely playing second fiddle. Just listen to Jefferson's actual instructions to the expedition. He spells it right out, writing, "The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River as may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent for the purpose of commerce." See? It was really all about trade, money, and securing a major foothold for a brand new nation.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, assembling the core, preparing for the wild.
Preparing to step right off the edge of the known map took some serious planning. Jefferson tapped Army Captain Meriwether Lewis as the leader, who then brought in his good buddy, Second Lieutenant William Clark, to co-lead. Jefferson even shipped Lewis off to Philadelphia to crash course medicine, astronomy, and botany. And check out this number, 862. Keep that staggering number in the back of your mind. That is exactly how many days this expedition ultimately took from start to finish. When Congress first threw down just $2,324 to fund the supplies, literally nobody had any idea how massive this undertaking was actually going to be. To survive those 862 days, they needed a very specific and frankly totally bizarre packing list. Let's look at what Lewis grabbed in Philly. They packed 193 pounds of portable soup, which, yeah, sounds completely unappetizing, but it was a crucial survival ration. They also brought 30 gallons of strong spirit of wine, mosquito netting, and 130 rolls of pigtail tobacco. Crucially, they packed Indian peace medals. These were special silver medals stamped with Jefferson's face, meant to be handed out as diplomatic gifts to tribal leaders. But, they also had to flex their military muscle. So they brought along a crazy .46 caliber Austrian-made repeating air rifle with a 20-round magazine. This thing was powerful enough to take down a deer. Oh, and we can't forget Lewis's dog. He bought a massive Newfoundland named Seaman. Seaman was an incredible swimmer and actually ended up being the only animal to finish the entire trip, hunting and guarding the camp from bears the whole way. So, packed to the absolute brim in a custom-built keelboat and 2 smaller boats, the Corps of Discovery sets off. That brings us to Section 3, Into the Unknown, Surviving the Journey. Let's trace out their actual route. The Corps, which had about 45 members at this point, officially pushed off from Camp Du Bois in Illinois on May 14, 1804. They spent that first winter hunkered down at Fort Mandan in what's now North Dakota. It wasn't until way later, November 1805, that they finally laid eyes on the Pacific Ocean. And then, of course, they had to make the agonizing trek all the way back, finally rolling into St. Louis on September 23, 1806. Now, looking at that massive timeline, a huge question hangs over this whole first leg. Would they even survive? I mean, despite all that prep in Philadelphia, these Americans were basically fish out of water out there. They were tramping through a landscape totally alien to them. But of course, it was deeply familiar to the indigenous populations who had lived there for centuries. So here's the absolute truth of the matter.
The expedition's survival relied entirely on the assistance of Native American nations. Along the way, they interacted with over 20 dozen indigenous nations. Without their help, their food, and their deep navigational knowledge, the Corps of Discovery would have absolutely starved during those brutal winters, or they would have just vanished into the Rocky Mountains, hopelessly lost. But it wasn't all just friendly handshakes right off the bat. The diplomacy on the river was incredibly high stakes. Take the Teton-Sioux standoff in September 1804, for example. The Lakota people, also known as the Teton-Sioux, controlled this massive inland empire, and they fully expected gifts or tribute from anybody passing through. When the expedition rolled up, communication was a total mess because their only Sioux interpreter wasn't there. Captain Lewis makes a massive blunder by offering the chiefs insulting, insufficient gifts. The warriors weren't having it. They seized a boat and an oar. Lewis immediately panics, orders his men to present their weapons, and Clark literally draws his sword. I mean, they were inches away from a bloody shootout that would have ended the whole expedition right then and there. But right before the powder keg blows, Chief Black Buffalo steps in and orders his men to back down. The Americans quickly smoothed things over with some better gifts, a bottle of whiskey, and later on more tobacco. Talk about a close call.
After surviving that nail-biter, they traveled upstream and camped out for the winter in the Mandan Nation's territory, building Fort Mandan. This brings us to Section 4, the Vital Interpreter, uncovering Sacagawea. Let's introduce one of the most famous and misunderstood figures in American history. It was at Fort Mandan that Lewis and Clark met a French-Canadian fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau and his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. Now, pop culture loves to paint this myth of Sacagawea as this sort of magical guide who single-handedly navigated the men through the trackless wilderness. But the historical reality is a bit different, though honestly no less vital. Historians are pretty clear she wasn't the primary guide. Instead, her real superpower was diplomacy. She was an absolutely essential interpreter, bridging the language gap for the captains. But maybe even more importantly, she served as a living, breathing symbol of peace. You see, during the trip, Sacagawea went into a really painful labor. Fun fact, Lewis actually gave her a potion made from a crushed rattlesnake rattle to help speed things up, and she ended up delivering a healthy baby boy named Jean-Baptiste. The mere sight of a native woman casually carrying her infant son was incredibly reassuring to any cautious tribes they bumped into. It instantly broadcasted that this heavily armed group of weirdly dressed men was just a peaceful diplomatic mission, not a war party. Having her and that baby along was literally one of the best shields the expedition had.
With Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and little Jean-Baptiste in tow, they pushed over the Continental Divide, navigated some totally treacherous rivers, and finally reached our next stop, Section 5, Ocean in View, the bitter end of the trail.
On November 7, 1805, they finally spotted the Pacific Ocean. Huge win, right? Well, reaching their goal definitely didn't mean they were safe. Actually, it just meant they were kicking off a horrific second winter. They ended up pinned down in this storm-racked, miserable stretch on the north side of the Columbia River. It was so bad that Clark literally named it Dismal Niche. They were freezing, getting pounded by rain, and staring down starvation. They were desperate for a better winter camp. Food was insanely scarce because all the elk, their main food source, had booked it away from the coast and up into the mountains. Plus, colds and influenza were ripping through the camp. So on November 24th, 1805, they did something truly remarkable. They held a vote on where to move. And what's wild about this moment in 1805 is that the vote explicitly included Sacagawea, a Native American woman, and York, an enslaved African American man. They all voted to cross over to the south side of the river, where they built Fort Clatsop to ride out the winter and ran up the American flag to officially stake their claim. After somehow surviving that brutal winter at Fort Clatsop, they began the massive, grueling trek back to St. Louis. Along the way, they dealt with stolen horses, a deadly skirmish with the Blackfeet Nation, and even an incident where Lewis got accidentally shot in the thigh by one of his own guys who mistook him for an elk. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. But finally, on September 23rd, 1806, they made it back. Let's look at Section 6, the true legacy, triumphs, and tragedies. All right, let's break down the final scorecard of this epic 862-day road trip. Their absolute number one priority, finding that continuous water route to the Pacific? Yeah, they totally failed. Because, well, it didn't exist. The Rocky Mountains were kind of in the way. But in almost every other category, they knocked it out of the park. They successfully opened diplomatic channels with over 70 indigenous tribes. On the science front,
They brought back seeds, artifacts, and formally described over 200 plant and animal species that European Americans had never seen before. And geography-wise, they drafted 140 maps, giving the U.S. its very first accurate look at the Pacific Northwest. But we can't talk about the legacy of this expedition without looking at the incredibly dark injustices attached to it. We need to talk about York. York was an enslaved black man owned by William Clark. He did backbreaking labor pulling the boats, he hunted for the crew, and he was actually incredibly crucial in diplomatic relations with native tribes who were fascinated by him. Yet when they finally got back east, the white explorers were showered with double pay and huge tracts of land. York? He received absolutely nothing, not a dime. William Clark completely refused to release him from bondage and forced him right back into slavery in Missouri. It's a really somber reality check on the whole triumph of American liberty narrative this story usually gets wrapped up in. Which brings us to the ultimate question we have to grapple with. Remember, Jefferson explicitly sent them out there to declare sovereignty and flex their military muscle to subordinate native tribes to the U.S. The maps they drew basically drew the blueprint for the eventual conquest and settlement of the entire West. So how do we weigh these absolutely monumental, undeniable scientific discoveries of those 862 days against the dawn of American expansionism, displacement, and conquest that they kickstarted? It's a really messy, dual legacy, and it demands that we look at America's most famous road trip not just as some triumphant adventure, but as a massive turning point that permanently altered the